starting. Oh, there we go. Just so everyone knows, we're recording this interview with Sue, and it will go up on our social media and our YouTube channel, so it's something that you could look back at or perhaps share with friends. So yeah, Sue, I'll just hand over to you if you could share a bit of your story of where God's been at work. And yeah, sure. That would be amazing. I'm going to shut up now.
Hi, my name's Sue Butler, and I lead Thirst, which is an organic relational community of faith, really, in Cambridge, which is where I normally live. I'm currently in France on sabbatical with my husband, who's also a vicar. I'm an ordained pioneer minister, but you don't have to be an ordained pioneer minister to be leading a work of God. I'm a woman with a portfolio because I'm also currently writing a PhD on fresh expressions and ecclesiology, and thoroughly enjoying it. So I'm always after new ideas. I was thinking about the ideas, first of all, that we were talking about. The first, for me, missional is when the church fully becomes the church, like in the book of Acts, it became missional. And there's this is part of my PhD, so I won't go into it in full detail here and bore you with it, which all PhD students do. But I've been reading a lot about this and really trying to figure out where the church becomes the church. Contextually, for me, the question is, what do you have in your hand and where are you placed? You know, it's not about writing down ideas and setting up a meeting and having a committee meeting and, you know, you'll hear what I think is. Formational, I think you've got to think long term. I think if we don't think long term about fresh expressions, as you know, we're thinking about God, which is eternal. And ecclesial, what will it look like in our own context? It's not linear, but it's a series of steps, but it's a whole. These things sometimes happen at wrong times, quote unquote, times you don't expect them to happen, but they all kind of, I think I like Tim's washing machine. That's kind of about how I would envisage it too. So being truly missional for me is formational for all concerned. And note that I say being missional. I think if we're considering being missional, perhaps it would be a good idea to unpack how we can be missional rather than doing mission. Being missional means that we're relational and having the seeds of the kingdom, and that lead and enable us to become ecclesial through formational and relational life together. And of course, in Acts 1:8, we read that the disciples were told to be witnesses in Jerusalem, where they already were. And then they were to go somewhere else. And the old idea of a missionary starts being a missionary to go to a faraway country, which is what I grew up with. I've realized as I grew older that it starts where I am. I knew when I was a young girl that God had called me to be a missionary, and it's only been in the last few years I've realized that that's what I am, but I didn't do it in a far country, which is what I thought I'd do. Anyway, at first, we started where we were with what we had in our hands in our own places. And about 20 years ago, I've changed all the names, so you won't recognize people that I know, but about 20 years ago, my friend Rose and I, who both had children in our local primary school in Cambridge, began to pray together, and we started to then pray with a group of friends and decided to have breakfast together once a week. Our breakfast became legendary because we ate good food and it attracted people. Always serve good food. On Friday mornings, we would finish at around lunchtime by praying for each other, and sometimes it'd go on until pickup time. And like the apostles and women in Acts, we were looking back, we realized that we had an expectancy that something was happening that was outside of our own understanding. And the more we prayed together, the more we shared a vision to reach out to the people in our own community at the school who we met in the playground. So we began to meet on a Friday for breakfast, and then we began to pray. That was weekly. Then we began to pray once a month on a Thursday night. And we prayed for each other and families, and we spent a lot of time praying. At one point, we had a map of the school where our children were, and a map of every classroom, and we prayed for all the relationships in the school between people that we knew. I wouldn't do it now because of GDPR and all of that stuff, but in those days, it's what we did. And our head teacher in the school was a Church of England head, and a strong Christian, which was brilliant. And there was great, the school became known because we all had relationship together, we were meeting together, and the community began to grow. And the head at the time was a really good friend and an encourager to us and our children. And during that period, we not only saw amazing things happen in the school, which had a long-term effect on the whole community, but the school during those days had a really good reputation as a school, and there was great pastoral care all around. So growth is about stories. about the stories of transformation of individuals and the effect of transformation on the broader community. And again, the book of Acts, full of stories. It's a book all about the different stories of what happened in the early church. You would all know that. Someone asked us, why do you think Thirsty is great, but why don't they go to church? And we asked people, it's always good to ask people why. And they said, well, our children will misbehave and we might not know what to do, because what we understand is that when you go to church, you've got to sit in rows. And I once went to church and somebody said to me, the pastor stood up or the vicar stood up and said, let us pray. And I was terrified because I thought, I've never prayed in my life. How will I pray? I don't. And of course, we forget that for us as insiders, we know the language and we know everything. And we try, sometimes when we try and think about starting a church, starting a fresh expression, we think from where we are and from what we know. And I think we have to move outside of that and to begin to think of things outside of ourselves. We are still some found out Sunday's the worst day for families, football, rugby games, shopping or family day. And when they do come over the threshold into our territory, we ask them to sit in straight rows on hard pews, close their eyes and talk to someone they can't see, which is plain weird, sing songs, rarely done apart from football matches, listen to a monologue, and then we serve up nasty coffee, cheap biscuits, and put a dish beside the biscuits saying for your donations. It's quite frankly insulting and does not bear any or much resemblance to the Church of Acts 2:42. And I don't think it shows us what God is like. Some of us have been praying anyway for a girl called Jamie, and we'd seen her walking along the road and in the playground, and she was really moody, and I knew that the head had trouble with her. Everybody in the school had difficulty with her. She was one of those parents that you never wanted to meet because she'd always have a go at you. And although I'd seen her, I didn't know her, but I began to pray for her, and so did, unbeknown to any of us, there were about 6 of us had begun to pray for her on a regular basis. And one evening I couldn't go to the prayer meeting, and Rose called me at about 11 o'clock at night asking me to pray, as a couple of the women had gone to Jamie's house. And in true Book of Acts style, during prayer for her, they'd had a picture of Jamie and decided to go and share it with her and ask if they could pray for her. And I protested and said, it's too late to go. You can't go at 11 o'clock to somebody's house in such odd circumstances. And 2, whilst I understood about pictures and words, and we believe the Holy Spirit gives them to us, she might not. And 3, she was a woman who had a reputation for being a bit angry with people. Too late, said Rose, they've gone. So the next morning at 7 o'clock, I received a phone call and heard from one of the girls that Jamie had been profoundly touched emotionally, spiritually and physically by the picture and words. She'd explained things that had happened to her that none of us had known about. And she had then prayed and stated that she wanted to become a follower of Jesus. I arrived at breakfast at around 9:30, and there sat Jamie. "Oi, you," she said, "I've got a bone to pick with you." So hardly knowing her, I was a bit nervous. And I said, "Oh, what's the matter?" She said, "Well, last night I told God that I was sorry for the things that I'd done wrong. I told God I wanted to forgive those that had wronged me. I told Christ that I wanted to become one of his followers, but do not ask me to become a Christian, because that is never going to happen." "Jamie," I said, "what do you think becoming a Christian is?" "Well, I'm never going to church," she said. That morning, about 15 or so of us sitting around the table discussed church, mission and growing in faith, though not in those terms. And some weeks later, unsolicited by any of us, she actually began to attend the local large charismatic church, and then went on a church plant and was in the worship band and everything else. And we always say she's slightly crazier Christian faith than any of us, but she's really out there. Some 10 years later, we were still continuing to meet, but we began to meet on Fridays in the school, and that's another whole long story which I won't tell you now. But we served wonderful breakfasts and watched the Numa series. And we watched Numa because it was only short, and we figured that it was actually quite accessible for people that weren't churchgoers. And so that's why we watched that, and we began to build relationships, and we invited our friends, and the school saw us as a supportive, loving, caring place that they could send parents into. So we built on relationships that by now we'd made with them and with other parents who would stop us and ask us in the playground to pray for them. People did everyday stuff, planting vegetables in the garden, cooking, learning how to take a chicken apart and make it last for a year, you know, all that kind of stuff. making birthday cards, and people were just blown away by doing everyday stuff. Then one Christmas around 2013, we had a breakfast where my friend who was sharing talked about the 5 women in the genealogy of Jesus. And as she began to talk, I noticed people just began to cry around the table as I identified with those women. And as tears flowed, that was the beginning of a story of the journey of faith for a new group of women who had come. And they began to ask questions about that book that Christians read. So we started a faith book club, reading the book of Acts, why not, and how people practiced faith in the early church. Interestingly, they also asked what was the thing that Christians do with the bread and wine. And they asked me, why couldn't we do that at breakfast next week? So we took ages getting through the Lord's Prayer, especially at the part where it says, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who have sinned against us, the words that we heard through sobs. And we still sometimes take a long time over communion and explain what it all is and what we're saying and why we do the things we do. And sometimes people still cry at God's amazing love and acceptance. Following on from this, I know that for some people here, this will be in the wrong order, but they asked me, what's that thing you do when you go under the water? So I said, what do you mean? Do you mean baptism? And they said, yeah, that baptism thing. So we gathered everybody that wanted to be baptized, and there were at that time about 13 people. We'd already done a baptismal service before, but there were about 13 family members from 4 or 5 different families. And whilst discussing being baptized with one of the women, she suddenly shouted out, Sue, it's like a bit like you go down under the water and you come up clean and you're a new person. I asked her if she'd read that anywhere, and she said, no, I've just thought of that myself. She said, actually, it's like you die and you become a new person. And I said to her, well, are you sure you haven't read that anywhere? She said, no, why? Where would I have read it? So I said, well, in the book of Romans. And we then talked about what was in Romans, and we discussed it. And she would often say after that, and she still says, actually, I knew something that was in the Bible without having read it. And she's quite proud of that. But to date, we've stopped counting the baptisms, but it's well over 30. We've had funerals we get asked to do funerals for all kinds of people that were connected to the school or connected to families. We find that we've become, or I have become, the vicar to lots of people that don't come to Thirst, but that are actually part of our community because they're connected to us through the families that do come. And it's a very, I've gone to parties before now and sat at the bottom of the stairs and prayed for people who've come out to me in the middle of the dancing and everything that's going on. So we no longer meet in the school, but it was great for the period that we did meet there. Many parents come to faith, and I'd encourage you to consider this if you've got a sympathetic head and staff in the school that you're in, because church schools, I remember George Ling's always saying that church schools are an open goal. I know it's very different nowadays and it's not always so simple, but I would really encourage people to consider that. So just finally, about what Thirst is. We've got a leadership of about 5 of us. We meet on Friday mornings for breakfast post-COVID and lockdown. We used to meet until a couple of years ago on Saturday afternoons and more latterly Sunday afternoons for Thirst 2, which is an all-age gathering in a local community centre where we eat good food, drink the best coffee, have a cafe-style informal gathering using multimedia lasting about 20 minutes. Very inclusive, and there's lots of chat back so that it's not just one person talking from the front. And about 40 minutes of organised games, football, parachute games, arts and crafts, reading newspapers, choir. We've tried everything to keep people interested. And finally, for those who wish, we do communion just before we go home. But the big thing for us has always been about inclusivity, and we have had people from all kinds of backgrounds. I think the thing about Thirst is you become a part of Thirst before you realise what it is you've become a part of, because you're embraced into the community and people find themselves organically growing with us, and we grow with them as we move together through what God's doing. So that's really all I wanted to say. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy if anybody wants to email me and ask me any more questions, I can do that too.